Book number 16 in my list on the Great American Read is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley in 1818. Now, this is one of those books that everyone knows at least vaguely what the story is, but I do really question just how many people these days have actually read it because we have this big image of what the Frankenstein story is these days, which is actually taken almost entirely by the James Whale film adaptation in 1931, because the original book has almost none of the stuff in that. The look of the Frankenstein monster, the bolts in his neck, the electricity even that's used to resurrect him, like all of that was completely done by the movie alone. And the book is much more of like thoughtful, somber examination of the situation. And if you're going to read it, you should know going in, it really doesn't have much of a traditional story to it per se, because that's not really what Mary Shelley was interested in. She just had an idea about how science might affect the world in the future, and that was like just the warning she was trying to give by telling a story about it. And anything about actually making an enjoyable story was kind of a secondary thing to her. So this is kind of a tough one to recommend just on the basis of the story alone, but luckily she was a good enough writer that this kind of stumbles into being mostly a good story just by accident. And there are still some very weird choices in it. There's a ton of scenery descriptions that go on too long, and a whole thing of another book getting shoved into the middle so that the creature can learn English. But for the most part, it is some quality stuff. And if you do have the patience to sit through some of that stuff, knowing going in helps a lot, I found, then you won't regret it, even if you do know the story going in. And even beyond the book itself, the story of how it was made is one of my favorites of all time. Is Yes, Mary Shelley was an 18-year-old girl who was having an affair with a famous poet, and he invited her to a like sleepover party with Lord Byron and some other famous writers, and they took turns telling horror stories late into the night. And what she came up with was the story of Frankenstein, basically right on the spot. And it went over well enough that she was able to make it into a book and then even published anonymously because people didn't really like women authors at the time. It made a ton of money, and she was regarded as enough of a success in just 5 years later that she was able to have it republished under her own name. Now that is an empowering story, any way you want to put it. And the third season of Genius that's coming up is actually going to be about her, and I can't wait to see it because that this is a story that deserves to be dramatized. It is just one of the all-time greats, and it feels like it's something that shouldn't exist in the real world. This is something that if you saw it made up, you would just dismiss it as being impossible to believe. But getting back to the book itself, we have these ideas about what science can do, even if it is never described. You know that it's all about bringing a dead thing back to life. And from what little description we do get, the creature in the book is actually probably made up of livestock parts mostly. Bet you didn't know that one. And um, we have, because of this, what is generally considered the first science fiction novel, because all the books before this really were not concerned with this kind of future looking technology. And there was fantasy, of course, but uh, Frankenstein was the first one to really make an effort to ground the story in some kind of quasi believable science that might one day be achieved, at least to the degree that it was understood at the time, at least like the first really famous one to do it. So it gets that title. And just because of that alone, I'd say it's worth checking out, like for pure historical value. And the good stuff in it is still good, and you have this great backstory. So all in all, one of this like just lightning out of a blue sky moments in literary history that I continue to be very glad it actually did happen, and um, I'm just looking forward to whatever comes next with this thing because we have gotten several adaptations of it. They've all put their own stamps on it, some better than others, of course, but there is still a lot of life in this thing, and I hope we see it brought back again, Frankenstein-like, if you will. But for now, I'm just happy with what we have. And up next, the one true person who has a real claim to be the successor of J.R.R. Tolkien in epic fantasy creates his magnum opus with A Song of Ice and Fire.